now messages from the executive and how we should palliate this?
I get that in a moment. Let me just mention something on the roads issue that
that we had brought up on the nation.
That we brought up. Mm-hmm. One thing we needed to understand is we've got a systemic problem with our roads. You know, it's always good for us to learn from what others have done and successfully. So one of the safest countries to drive in is Sweden. You know, and if you look at how Sweden approaches the problem, it's not the way we do. We think that it's a problem that is primarily solved through enforcement. You know, but actually they learned that you really need to be looking at the design of the transport system, and by the transport system I mean not just the roads, but everything that Yusuf was talking about. So whether it is how our police work on the roads, it's how our matatus work, how do people actually use the roads, you know, and are we designing them to suit that? The largest percentage of people dying are pedestrians, you know. Yet we built
footbridges,
outer ring road without any places for them to cross. And more importantly, where are we building these roads? If you build a 6-lane highway that passes through a town, you will expect that people will try and cross it. You know, so we're not really thinking about these things, about where we are placing our roads, you know, when we expand them, what are the provisions that are made for people to interact, to cross these roads, you know, etc. And then when it comes to driving, I mean, think of how our matatu drivers are paid. You know, they're paid essentially, you know, you bring a pot of money to me in the evening, and what is left is yours. You know, what sort of behavior does that incentivize? That guy will try and make as many trips as he can because that's how he gets paid. So we've got to think about the design of the entire system, transport system. You know, and it's by changing that, as the Swedes found out, it is a system that creates the behavior. It's what generates the behavior. People are reacting to the incentives on the road. You know, and until we change that system, then we'll keep here. And one final thing is, we need to understand we don't have accurate statistics about road deaths. We've been saying 3,000 for a long time. If you look at WHO, it's talking about 15,000. You know, on us, our NTSA only gets reports from policemen about people who die on the scene. We don't know guys who die in the hospital. Nobody follows up on those. You know, so it's actually quite important that we start getting accurate statistics, and we know what the scale of the problem is. Coming to what you asked about technology, I think the media has kind of lost the role it used to have as sort of a gatekeeper. Before the advent of things like the internet, etc., the media would be how government communicated to the people. You know, they would mediate that interaction. You know, and I think that to a very large extent is gone. Governments now do have direct access to the press, and I think that creates a few problems. First, a few problems and also a few advantages. It's good in the sense that people can directly interact with governments. They now don't have editors who decide for them what issues are important, etc. We have seen issues can be raised right now, even on places, forums like Twitter, etc., by citizens, and then they make it onto the national agenda. So that's a good thing. But also, as Trump has shown, that governments are now able to manipulate these sorts of systems, you know, to get out and sort of avoid the accountability space. And I think our media has been slow to react to this, you know, and especially in the case even of the U.S., where we've seen them kind of running after Trump, you know, sort of reporting on each and every tweet he puts out, you know, etc., and forgetting their own agenda-setting role. And I think...
And I want us to look at maybe some of that communication. If you can just look at some tweets. Sometimes previously you'd have only had from a president if he had a press conference or if he was giving a declaration. And let's look at some of those tweets. We have Donald Trump, of course, has, his Twitter handle, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un just stated that the nuclear button is dead. This is when they had a spate with talking about whose button is bigger than who, which sometimes would make a leader even, I don't know if it diminishes his authority, but let's look at a different tweet and possibly even from our very own president, if we can look at that. But also, Mheshimiwa, bringing in the aspect of the president being able to communicate directly with the electorate. There's another one from Trump. Just had foreign minister speak. Okay, they're moving a bit too fast, but there you go. Your thoughts on the ability now for the presidency to be able to communicate with the electorate directly?
Well, now, in the old days, you see every government, every institution wanted to influence what goes out in the public domain using the media. And that's why we had the public relation industry coming up. But the relationship, as has been indicated, is that there was always an editor who controlled an element of what bit of that could go onto the public domain. But now we have a situation completely different. In fact, we have a revolutionary situation in which people like Trump and the American presidency has short-circuited. There's no filter, there's nothing. He gets directly to his audiences. And again, it also changes the way even the White House communicates, in the sense that there is no mechanism in the White House to control what he does.
What he says.
So this is a completely a new chapter in social media, in new media, and the use of media. And not only does he communicate on national, he actually talks directly to presidents, leaders of other countries. That one was about North Korea. This week he has been dealing with Iran.
Yes.
He's been threatening directly to take action. Not only that, does the information go out, but they try to manipulate the kind of information, the kind of thinking that they want. So I think we're getting into a very dangerous state in which, again, much of that information is not reliable. It is not truthful. There's a lot of we're in the post-truth period in which the president can say and challenge anything without anybody else been able to counter-check him. And I think this is a dangerous...
but doesn't that leave us in a position where, as the media, by the time that tweet is going out, we should be able to wait and first of all tell how much weight does it have? For instance, if a president threatens a different nation, shouldn't we be in a position where we have the information that we can pick this and either say this is an empty threat or it is actually a valid threat? I
think the media is becoming increasingly, the old media is becoming increasingly irrelevant. The president is setting the agenda. They follow him. He doesn't follow them. He's not the one wanting to know what the media is saying. If he disagrees with a particular line of the old media, all he needs to do is shout fake news. And his audience, his power base, buys into that, believes in that. So it doesn't really matter what others think about what he says and what he does.
Okay. Koki, your thoughts on technology's influence?
I just know that if you go back to theory, the communication theory insists that in government there is a process of gathering information, and there is a process of disseminating that information. And that is systemic in the sense that you have people in the field, the Kenya News Agency, their work was to go out, come back and report, and then that is centralized to inform the development agenda of the country. But then again, there is the personality aspect of our presidents who come in, who might want to have the populist kind of outlook and be able to, also kind of have their personality permeate in leadership and forget that maybe what they say have consequences. And again, even so, if you have the presidential communication unit, it needs to be able to help him or her filter whatever they're saying, so that it doesn't disrupt, their agenda, or doesn't have people poke holes in what they're saying. So, of course, I've seen in the last week that in Kenya there has been a bit of limitation about what goes on online. And it seems as if it is centralized now that you have a new spokesperson. Now everything is centralized and it can be said through specific channels, which I believe is the right way to go. Because again, you don't want to have, leaders being sentimental online, or taking advantage, like Mheshimiwa said, to propagate, actually to spread propaganda against other institutions that should be checking what is going on in government. So I think Trump, you must know that he is...
he's just Trump.
He's just Trump, yes. And he has been in the limelight for long. And for him, that personality, that's what gives him life, you know, to be out there. And therefore, he has people, not only the media, but his own communication team always cleaning up for him for things that shouldn't, you know, come out.
I think one of the things that leads these sorts of behavior, I think it's the media has to take responsibility for part of it. I think it's largely a reflection of the failure of the press, I think largely across the world, in terms of sort of setting the agenda. I think we went through a period, and this was informed by both the declining revenues of newspapers because they were losing advertising from their traditional sources, etc. It all fled online, you know, and they started becoming more sensational, you know, less about the issues, more about the drama, you know, and we've seen that happen here as well, you know, and I think that kind of alienates people. People then don't know whether to trust the newspapers, you know, they don't know whether to trust KTN, you know, etc. And that then becomes exacerbated when you've got demagogues such as Trump, and I think to a certain extent Uhuru Kenyatta as well, you know, going out there bashing the media constantly and consistently, you know, near kufunga nyama, you know, and things like that, you know. I think our media needs to reinvent itself and to focus more on its content rather than its ability to, rather than so much its profitability. I think the profitability will come as a consequence of having good content. The New York Times
and how do we shape that content? Because like you mentioned, and like I think Koki mentioned, I think it was Mheshimiwa, that we can become irrelevant by virtue of the fact that previously we would be the ones who would go and sit maybe in a press conference, listen to what the president has to say, then disseminate that information. So people were waiting for either the radio to, you know, have that at 1 o'clock or the newspaper, but that's changing because if the president now can literally communicate directly, we basically have to be cut short. So what content and how do we package that?
Well, two things. First, the media does still do lots of these things, and lots of what it does is important. So if you think about what dominates on Twitter is really what your guys at the high level, at the national level are saying. You know, but there's still reporting to be done about what happens at local levels. You know, these things that actually influence people or impact people directly. You know, there is a lot of space for us. There's a lot of space for contextualizing what is being said, for actually explaining stories rather than simply following them. You know, and this the media is not basically doing. You know, and that's how you're failing in your work. I'll give you one example of newspapers that actually are making money. Think of the New York Times. They changed their entire focus away from let's look for advertising to saying let's look for subscribers. And that meant that they had to produce content that people want to buy and not simply say that I've got this mass of people who read me and I'm going to sell that mass to the advertiser. That is going back to the roots of journalism. You remember before, newspapers would essentially establish themselves, you know, by providing good content. Then they get an audience, and then they are able to get advertisers. So advertisers chasing newspapers. That dynamic has been shifted now. You know, it is newspapers running after advertisers because they don't have the content to appeal to an audience.
But I think if you go by research, the Kenya Audience Research Foundation 2017 report actually stated that most Kenyans, 90% of Kenyans rely on legacy media for their information. So it's, and 30% actually rely on social media. That's what the findings say. So media still has a place. But what Gadara is saying is that the content needs to be retweaked, because by the time you're going for the press conference, the information is out.
It's already out.
So therefore, what context and background can you add to what is already in place? How can you link ideas so that people can be able to see relationships between one issue to another? Yeah, so for me, I still think that media needs to, again, refocus what is the nature of the information they are packaging.
And even with those statistics, they are bound to change over time, because the reason why there is still a big number that relies on media, it's possibly because of things like internet penetration. There could also be the authenticity that media has had and is viewed as the authentic news as opposed to Twitter and Facebook and all that.
Yeah, but Michael, when you look at it critically, what's online is normally a story. That is either from mainstream or alternative media. And I don't want to say gutter press. I just want to say alternative media. And that story is what generates conversation. Rarely will you have a tweet just generate conversation. Most of the times, if you look at Twitter, it will be, yes, a little piece of writing and then a link. And therefore, most of the time, it will be a story. And that's the story that will generate conversation. Yes.
Okay.
So I still think that media has a role, and like he says, if you add a bit more context and background to it, and again, look at how you're selling the product, then you're better off as an entity.
All right.
I must say that traditional media in Kenya is facing major challenges. And I think this is not new. Even when I was a journalist, I always found that the readership was very low. If you look at a country with 45 million population, with a very large literacy base, how many people read the Daily Nation is the biggest paper? 100,000? How many papers do they sell? Very small. So their this business model is very wanting, in the sense that the content, it's the content, as we have said, content is king. I don't understand a lot of what is happening in our capital city. No paper covers Nairobi, for example. No paper covers the Eastlands, where the area that I represent in Parliament. Usually it is the sensational stories of gangs or deaths or some terrible stories. But society is getting on with its lives, daily activities. There's no reporting of that. And until we change our business model, there's a lot to be told. Media has a role. The second element that I find lacking in the media is challenging the status quo and challenging a lot of the things that are happening in our society. We are not consistent in that. And newspapers in our history have taken sides. They have taken political positions, they have taken economic and social positions vis-a-vis the public. So the public does not trust, they don't believe that this is a media that represents their interest. It represents the interest of the ruling elite, normally. And unless we can get an outspoken, independent media, traditional media is really seriously challenged. That position has been taken by social media to a certain extent. And the question is, how truthful or how believable, how credible is social media going to be? Is it just going to be another gutter?
And I guess that question media would be answered by where the source and what platform of social media. Because at the end of the day, if, for instance, Donald Trump tweets, that's him as a person. But if, for instance, there was a tweet from maybe Standard Media or Standard Media Group, then that should be viewed as authentic based on where it's coming from. Do you think that
But there's a good example recently on that. Donald Trump met the publisher of the New York Times. And it was agreed that this was going to be off-the-record meeting. But as soon as the meeting was over, Trump tweeted. And the New York Times publisher was forced to respond and say, this is what we discussed. I disagreed with him on this, and so on. So in a way, that is exactly what was expected of the New York Times too, once that story was out, to come out with its position and challenge the information that was out in the public.
I think the media has to look at its role in amplifying things that, for example, like Trump do. You know, so he puts out a tweet at whatever early in the morning, when he's just woken up. You know, he has these sort of famous rants that he goes on. You know, and then they become the news. You know, so somebody makes a judgment that this is what's important for Americans or for the world to hear, and you amplify it, and that's how you get to a point where you make that decision not based on the fact that it's going to sell you newspapers, because lots of times this is what it's based on, but on its actual news values. I think our newspapers are losing that idea of what is actually news, what is valuable for public to hear, what should they be talking about, and we end up spending endless amounts of time discussing things that are really not too relevant to our everyday lives or how our countries are governed. I think that's a really huge problem. Finally, I think technology itself also opens up opportunities for the media, and I think our media is being quite slow in adapting to that. If you think about, for example, the prevalence of data now that we get, it's quite a lot. You can hoover up through the internet, etc. And that is can be a source of more in-depth, more better informed reporting. Something like just being able to research a little bit on what you've heard. Politicians say, and to check it. Did he say something different? Feedback, that's a Google search. And that can bring up quite a lot of things that your own newspapers reported a few years back.
Right.
And you can start contextualizing the stories you're taking.
And also
I think,
putting the links.
Yeah, actually putting the links and linking stories. One of the things that I really have a beef with our media is the way, for example, corruption is reported. It's all these many different scams. And we always get this idea like we're being bombarded by them. But it's because our media doesn't make a story that links these scams, as if they're treated as if they're completely different. Yet they all stem from very similar and common roots. And those common roots are what we should be talking about. That's what we should be changing. But we end up talking about the symptoms rather than the disease.
Okay, I think for me, playing the devil's advocate, I think Trump has really, in his rants and in his method of discrediting the media, has exposed America for what it is and who they are. And it has really brought out the real systemic issues, like the live nature of racism, the live nature of, the hatred that exists amongst them, the live nature of their concerns, as Americans, that foreigners are coming in to take their jobs. He's really brought that out. Now, what that does is then the media, which was a gatekeeper then, to protect the government's interests, have to just follow what Trump is saying to discredit it. But at the end of the day, I think we have a better, clearer picture
of who America is.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, I kind of disagree with that. Having lived, worked, and studied in the United States, I think there is another America, a very different America than the one that is presented by Trump and his ideological supporters. I think. On the whole, America is a very tolerant society. It's a much more open society. It's a country of migrants. You find, like in my neighborhood where I lived in New York, you find people from all over the world. And in fact, even the main language in those streets is not even English. It's mostly Spanish and other languages, very large Latino population. So I think what has happened now with what Trump is doing is that he's actually created a very narrow tunnel view of the United States, which is quite misleading. And also to argue things in that there's only A or B, there's it's my way or no other way. That also is quite misleading. And I think there's this position has been challenged all the time, even within the United States. But what is surprising is that he continues to dominate the news headlines. He sets the agenda every morning, and his tweets become the news. And I think that is a failure on the part of the media, and they gave him that opportunity when he was running for the presidency. I was in the United States getting treatment for my legs, and I was watching television, and he would be covered live. something that I'm not familiar with as a journalist when I was working in the United States and Europe was that you don't cover every press conference in full. There is editorial control of it. That had completely gone. And then there's one particular channel that he loves, and even now apparently, as he sits in the White House, if he disagreed with a particular discussion, is watching like this particular discussion, he would call and intervene and say, I don't agree with that. Yes. And he would be allowed.
All right.
He drives the agenda, and the agenda is to expose what the dominant elite group in the American thinks.
And I want us to wind up and maybe come back home. And Gadara, your closing thoughts, but also the fact that media, or let me say journalists, have now found place, let's say, in the executive and in the state in terms of communication. What is it that we should expect out of them? And of course, we do know the likes of Kanzedena, who now are, State House spokesperson, and whether that is, I don't know what that says about the profession.
Well, the media has always found spaces to go into government. It's a communications function, and they will be given jobs. We show them even during the famous tea they were having at State House in 2013, basically asking, for jobs. I would have hoped that they would professionalize it. But I think once they go in, they become part of the enemy. I mean, the government is constantly trying, as all governments do, to shape the conversation, national conversation, to suit its own agenda. And these people essentially have become communications consultants to governments. We shouldn't really regard them as journalists once they go across. And I think that it is incumbent upon the media itself, to be generating or creating the sorts of people and retaining the sorts of people who can help hold that mechanism, that government to account, and to decipher the things that are coming out. I think it is really sad that our media has more or less given up its role, especially in the reporting on State House, to the PSU. So PSU writes up a story and it's run as news on the newspapers. It's not, it doesn't...
It's not verified.
Exactly, then go through an editorial process, and that's how we end up with stories such as what we had in Cuba, and the president went to Cuba and essentially unveiled a bust of his father that he had paid for, or the government had paid for in this park, and then tells us that Cuba is honoring them, So we've got to be really careful about how we do that. But there's one story that you guys have mentioned that I think we really need to talk about before we close. And this was Justin Muturi summoning journalists because of coverage for the guys from the People. And I think that is really, really atrocious. They've done their job. They've reported on corruption in Parliament. And instead of actually dealing with those issues, and by the way, it's not the first time we're hearing about corruption in Parliament. It's been a long, long-running story, throughout. And we're now seeing kind of the victimization, and this is not the first time it's happening again. You remember when they had reported again on parliamentary meetings, minutes or parliamentary discussion on the corruption in the Interior Ministry, and we had other journalists being taken up. So it's quite important, I think, that we put a spotlight on that and really condemn what Justin Muturi has done.
Yeah, I think, media houses must take responsibility for covering for their journalists. After all, they're supposed to have legal systems within the media house to ensure that their journalists are protected. Because at the end of the day, I work for this media house. I'll get my sources. I will share what I can with the editorial body, and therefore the protection must come from the organization, not the other way around. I think my parting shot is there is a fallacy to believe that every journalist can be a communication person. That's what I think. Yeah, because
and in some cases an MC as well, which is not the case.
Yeah. I think that the disciplines are totally different in the sense of what they need to do. And the communication world is more about shaping agenda, like you said, making sure that the right information comes out, making sure that you're talking about the right things, and educating people about what's important. The journalist is a good person in the sense that he can tell the story as it is, but there are a bit of limitations when you take this person to a communication setup where now this person has to make sure the information is sifted and is relevant to what is happening. So it is good that journalists find spaces in communication, but then if you have astute communicators in those positions, then you find that the nature of communication also alters. It's not just about being a spokesperson. There's a lot of mechanics that goes behind creating a certain message and sending it out.
Okay. Yeah. Mheshimiwa, you're parting short.
Yeah, I first of all wanted to correct this issue on the speaker, is that the speaker does not have any powers to intervene and control what the media says. And to a certain extent, I do not agree with some of the sentiments that were expressed in the chamber yesterday about the media. But here, I think you need to understand that the two journalists who have been criticized are accredited to Parliament, and therefore have certain rules and regulations that they have to follow in reporting parliamentary affairs. And I think it is in that context that they have been summoned or invited to come and explain.
Shed more light.
Yes, and they don't have to if they want to. There's no compulsion. There's no rule that regulation that would say that they must come. Otherwise, if they don't come, they would lose their accreditation to reporting in Parliament. But I think that my parting shot on general on the media is that there is really no shortcut to quality journalism. It is critical reporting, investigative reporting, getting your facts right, challenging. That is the only way you can challenge the powers that be and become an effective person and create an informed public opinion, create an informed citizenship. So I think that we should put more emphasis on the training, ethical, professional training. Editors should give and protect journalists who are doing their job. And the better they get in delivering the information, the better it is for us as a country and as a consumers of this particular
of what they have to give.
So I think the onus is on the media.
All right.
The media to put its act together and to make sure that, in fact, when they challenge authority, when they take positions that are important for us, that they do so with the right information to be able to...
facts.
With facts.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll have to wind up right there. That's Kokyo Ching, lecturer USIU in Journalism and Communication, Honorable Yusuf Hassan, who is the Member of Parliament for Kamkunji, and Patrick Gadara, who's a communications consultant. That's the newsroom. It's now 26 minutes to 8 o'clock. And Zinzi, what do we have lined up before we take the break?
Well, Michael, you know today is Wednesday, and if it's Wednesday, it's all a matter of your health. So later on in the show, we'll be talking about fibroids. The month of July was the awareness month. You get to hear from a beautiful survivor, and she tells her story. We cannot wait to have that conversation. So stay with us. We'll be right back after this short, quick commercial break.